Her hobby was reading obituaries, until one of them predicted her fate. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Type a comment below. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? Your presence adds something special to every mystery we share. Now, the story begins. It had rained during the night, a fine, ceaseless drizzle that blurred the window panes of the Quai des Orfèvres and left the pavements dark as slate. Chief Inspector Maigret stood at his office window, his pipe clenched between his teeth, watching. A black umbrella moved slowly along the embankment, as if it had no place in particular to go. The Seine below was swollen and sluggish, lapping against the mossy stone steps. Behind him, the radiator gurgled faintly. His overcoat hung on the back of the chair, still smelling faintly of damp wool, as though it had absorbed the melancholy of the weather. He wasn't working on any pressing case. The files on his desk were the usual sort. A theft from a dairy cart in Belleville, a brawl between drunkards near the Gare de l'Est. Nothing that required Maigret, not really. The phone had been silent all morning, and even Lucas, who usually brought some petty agitation into the room, had not yet arrived. Madame Maigret had packed him a lunch of soft camembert, 2 hard-boiled eggs, and a roll wrapped neatly in wax paper. She'd mentioned, just before he left the flat, that the concierge's mother had died. A good age, she'd said, 87, quiet. You probably didn't even know her name. Maigret had nodded. He hadn't. But the remark had stayed with him, the way it had been said, quiet, forgotten, as if life's end were no more than a small administrative matter. He tapped out his pipe gently against the ashtray and refilled it, tamping down the tobacco with a practiced thumb. He wasn't thinking about the concierge's mother, not precisely, but something hovered there, just outside the clear boundaries. Gove thought. He had been a policeman too long not to trust that kind of unrest. At 10:15 the door creaked open, and a figure hovered just outside the frame, dripping from the rain. It was Janvier, carrying a folded newspaper under his arm and wearing a look that combined curiosity and apology. "There's a woman. Downstairs," Janvier said. "She asked for you, not a complaint, not really. Says she only wanted to speak for a moment." Maigret gave a shrug, more of acceptance than interest, and reached for his overcoat. The lining was still cold. He slipped it on anyway, and followed Janvier down the tiled corridor and the curving stairs. The woman waited in the lobby. She was perhaps 55, small, with a face that might once have been lively, but now bore the pallor of someone who had stopped expecting to be noticed. Her coat was outdated, herringbone tweed, belted, and her hat slightly askew from the wind. She held a leather handbag to her chest as though it contained something breakable. She gave a little start when Maigret appeared. "I'm sorry to trouble you, monsieur," she said, voice soft, almost childlike. It's probably nothing." He nodded toward the corridor. "Let's have a word, madame." She followed him into the small interview room, and he gestured toward the wooden chair. She sat delicately, keeping her bag on her knees. He didn't open a file, he didn't take notes. Instead, he lit his pipe again and let the silence settle around them like a second fog. "My name is Léonie Brol," she said after a pause. "I live on Rue des Écoles, a boarding house. I've been there 27 years. The room used to belong to my husband, he was a postman, died in 1949. Maigret nodded, saying nothing. "I read the obituaries every day," she continued, looking slightly embarrassed. "Not morbidly, I find it comforting. Like people are still being remembered." He nodded again. A gesture of understanding, not encouragement. "3 days ago I read about a man, Fernand Laval. The name meant nothing at first, but then—" She opened her handbag and pulled out the folded newspaper. I remembered it. I'd seen it before. That name. In a letter. "A letter addressed to a girl in my building. A tenant. She's very quiet. Keeps to herself. Mademoiselle Deslorges." Maigret leaned back slightly. Not a movement of interest, but of balance. A repositioning. "You saw her letter?" "I saw the post for Madame Tessier, the landlady. She has arthritis. I don't open letters, of course not. But this one stood out. Heavy envelope. Foreign postmark. The name. Fernand Laval. I noticed it because the girl's face changed when she saw it. It wasn't surprise, it was something else. She looked guilty. Did she speak about it? No. But yesterday she went out early and I happened to be in the foyer when she left. She dropped something. A train ticket, one way to Nancy. I picked it up and knocked at her door later to return it. But she didn't answer. She didn't come home last night either. "And you're worried?" Leonie Brault hesitated, eyes flickering toward the rain outside the window. "It's not my place. But there's something about her. A sadness. And now this man, Laval, he died. He jumped from a bridge in Lyon. The obituary didn't say much, only that he was unmarried. An export clerk, and now the girl's gone too." Still, Maigret said nothing. "I'm not saying there's a crime, only I thought of you." That last sentence caught him. He had not introduced himself. Maigret's brow lifted, but he only nodded once more. Then he stood, gently took the obituary clipping she had folded back into her hand, and held it for a moment, reading the short, grey paragraph. "I'll have a look," he said quietly. She let out a small breath, neither relieved nor expectant. She had done her part, whatever that part was. By 11, Maigret was walking again along the quay, the drizzle dampening his collar. He had made no decision. He had no jurisdiction, but already he was imagining the hallway of the Rue des Écoles, patterned wallpaper, the smell of boiled cabbage, a staircase worn down at the middle. A girl too quiet, a dead man in Lyon, and a woman who read obituaries, a story perhaps, or perhaps just life as it always was, sad, opaque, inexplicably intersecting. He turned up his collar and kept walking. The boarding house on Rue des Écoles stood quietly between a shuttered bookshop and a bakery that hadn't changed its window display since Epiphany. The street was narrow and the buildings leaned slightly, as if age had drawn them closer together. Maigret arrived on foot just after noon, not out of urgency, but because he had nothing more pressing to do, or so he told himself. The façade was grey, mottled with soot and streaks of rain. The iron gate squeaked under his hand, and inside the small courtyard, potted geraniums wilted in the damp. Somewhere above, a radio played softly, a chanson from another decade. He didn't announce himself with a badge or title. He rang the bell as anyone else might, and after a short wait, the door was opened by a man in carpet slippers. He wore a threadbare cardigan and had the air of someone who had been interrupted during something unimportant. "Yes." "Good day. I'm looking for Madame Tessier," Maigret said gently. The man scratched his temple with a yellowed fingernail. "Up the stairs, first floor, left door. She's having her chicory coffee." Maigret nodded his thanks and ascended the stairs slowly, his hand grazing the wooden banister, polished by decades of use. On the first landing the door stood ajar, and a frail voice called out before he could knock. "You can come in." I heard the creak. Inside, Madame Tessier sat at a small round table near the window, steam rising from a chipped cup. Her hair was white and coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. She wore a blue housecoat with a button missing and didn't bother to stand. "Inspector Maigret," he said by way of introduction, removing his hat. "I know who you are. You've been in the papers enough times." Her voice was dry, practical. "What's it about?" "I'm not sure," he said truthfully. "A tenant of yours. Mademoiselle Deslorges. She frowned slightly. The one on the 3rd floor. Quiet girl. Never late on the rent. Vanished yesterday. She hasn't returned? No. But that's not so unusual, is it? Girls. Come and go. I try not to pry. But you noticed. I notice everything, I just don't interfere. He liked her already. She reminded him of women who had lived too long in the same chair, who knew things without needing to speak of them. Do you know anything about a man named Fernand Laval? She looked at him more directly now, as if weighing whether this was gossip or something more serious. No, she said at last. Not a name I've heard in this house, but if it's connected to Deslorges, you do better asking Léonie Brault. That one knows everything, even the things that never happened. She mentioned you have arthritis. I do. She helps with the post? More than that. Keeps the stove going, fetches groceries, feeds the cat when I forget. She thinks it makes her indispensable. She might be right. Maigret stood, thanking her with a soft word, and left her sipping her chicory as if the conversation had never occurred. He climbed to the 3rd floor, past faded wallpaper with a repeated fleur-de-lis motif. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single bulb behind frosted glass. Mademoiselle Deslorges' door was closed, its brass number slightly crooked. He knocked once. No response. He turned the handle gently. It was locked. He tried again, then pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. But the kind of silence that felt settled, not recent. He stepped back, then turned as he heard soft footsteps behind him. It was Léonie Brault, holding a wire basket with 2 apples and a bottle of milk. She wore the same coat as Poirot and had a scarf tied beneath her chin, the knot precise. I thought you might come, she said simply. You haven't seen her since yesterday. No. Her curtains have been drawn since early morning. That's not like her. She usually opens them by 8. Can you open the door? She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and removed a key. I look after the spare set, for Madame Tessier. He took it without a word and turned the lock. The door opened with a soft click. The room was small, a single bed, a wardrobe, a table with a typewriter and an empty coffee cup. A vase with wilted tulips sat near the window, and on the radiator a cardigan had been draped, still damp. The smell was of lavender water and faint tobacco. There were no signs of disorder, no note, no clothes missing that he could tell, only the sense that something had paused, not ended but paused. On the table, beside the typewriter, lay an envelope with a lion postmark. The name written in slanted blue ink, Fernand Laval. He didn't touch it. He stood instead, hands behind his back, looking at the room as a whole. A life compacted into 15 square meters, the kind of space that was easy to leave behind. Do you think she's in trouble? Léonie asked softly behind him. I don't know yet. Will you find her? Maigret didn't answer right away. He was studying the shoes lined beneath the bed. All pairs except one were present. The empty space told its own story. She left on foot, he said. Léonie tilted her head. No taxi, no suitcase, just a handbag and 1 pair of walking shoes. She'd never do anything terrible, Léonie added, but her voice lacked conviction. Maigret turned to her, nodding once in thanks. He'd seen enough for now. He descended the stairs slowly, stopping briefly on the 2nd floor, where the hallway smelled of stewed leeks. Someone coughed behind a door. Life went on. Back on the street he looked up at the grey building. The rain had let up slightly, and the smell of yeast from the bakery reached him now. He had no case, no order from above, only the face of a girl who didn't come home and a dead man in Lyon whose name echoed too precisely. He lit his pipe and walked, letting his thoughts arrange themselves not by logic but by feeling. It wasn't about guilt yet, only something quiet that didn't fit, and that, more than anything, was what always brought him closer. The train to Lyon arrived, under a sky as colourless as dishwater. Maigret leaned against the window of his compartment, watching the industrial outskirts of the city slide past. Chimneys, warehouses, brown rivers, and endless rooftops, all blurred into the same tired grey. It was early afternoon by the time he stepped onto the platform. There had been no formal order to travel, no telegram from the prefecture, no crime, officially speaking. And yet, the name Fernand Laval lingered in his thoughts, like the smell of a blown-out candle. Faint, but persistent. A man who had leapt from a bridge, a girl who vanished, and a letter that connected them in a way not yet clear. He lit his pipe outside the station while a porter wheeled past with a squeaky cart. The air smelled of rain and coal smoke. A few meters down, a red-faced man in a conductor's cap argued with a woman over a suitcase. All around, people were coming and going, brisk and indifferent. Only Maigret stood still. He made his way to the address listed in the obituary, a modest residential street near the banks of the Rhône. The building was not unlike the one on Rue des Écoles, though less worn by time. It had white shutters, a clean entrance, and a sign that read Appartement à louer in the lower window. The concierge was a pale man in his 60s, with red suspenders and stiff shoulders. He did not seem surprised by the visit, nor particularly interested. "Laval?" he repeated. "Yes, lived here 4 years. Quiet man, wore a tie every day, always polite. Any family?" "Not that I know of. Never a visitor, not even for Christmas." Maigret nodded slowly. "Did he seem troubled lately?" The concierge shrugged. "Didn't talk much. Always reading. Left early, came home late. A man who didn't ask for anything." "And how did you hear of his death?" "Police came. Said he jumped from the Pont de la Guillotière. Papers in his coat pocket. No struggle. No signs of violence." "Do you know if he received mail from Paris?" "Now and then. Handwritten letters, pale blue envelopes, always the same handwriting." "Did you ever see the sender?" "No." "Where are his belongings now?" "In his room. The police sealed it, but I have the key. They said they'd be back to collect the rest. Would you like to see?" Maigret nodded. The concierge took a ring of keys from a drawer and led him up a stairwell that smelled faintly of beeswax and floor polish. On the second floor, he unlocked a plain wooden door and stepped back. The apartment was neat, nearly ascetic. A narrow bed, a desk, 2 chairs, a brown overcoat hung behind the door. The floorboards creaked as Maigret walked slowly around the space, absorbing the quiet. The air was stale but clean, like a room too orderly for anyone truly living in it. He opened a drawer in the desk, neatly stacked receipts, envelopes, and a small address book. The handwriting was small and slanted. He paused when he reached a name. Delorge, C, Paris, Rue des Écoles. He stood motionless for a moment, listening to the silence of the room. Then he sat in the single chair and turned a few more pages. No other familiar names, just a scattering of entries, dry, functional, an acquaintance in Marseille, a grocer in Lyon, a tailor. On the desk were 2 books, one a volume of Maupassant, the other a German grammar guide. On the inside cover of the grammar book, written in faded ink, was a line, "Pour Claire en souvenir de Garmisch, 1946. He closed the book slowly. Claire, the girl on Rue des Écoles. He examined the wardrobe next. 2 identical grey suits, a worn pair of shoes, a scarf with a small tear along the hem. Nothing out of place, nothing dramatic. But in the bottom drawer, under a folded shirt, He found a single envelope, unstamped, unsealed. Inside was a piece of paper with a short note written in the same slanted hand as the address book. "I cannot keep pretending. You are not to blame. But I have grown tired of waiting. It was always going to be one of us." Maigret read the note twice, then once more. The phrasing was strange, intimate, but detached, the kind of message written for someone who would understand everything that wasn't said. He left the note where he found it and stepped out into the hallway. The concierge was waiting with a curious look, but Maigret gave no sign of what he'd discovered. "Did Laval ever receive phone calls?" he asked. "Never heard the phone ring." Back outside, Maigret walked slowly toward the Pont de la Guillotière. The sky had begun to clear slightly, and the Rhône shimmered faintly under the light. The bridge was wide, lined with iron railings, and beneath it the water moved steadily, not violent, not still. He stood there for a long time, leaning against the cold railing, imagining the last steps of Fernand Laval. The man's shoes, perhaps wet from rain, his coat buttoned neatly. No hesitation, only silence, and a fall that left no splash. Anyone remembered. Maigret lit his pipe, shielding the flame from the breeze, and watched the current. People passed him, students, a man with a dog, a woman pushing a pram, but they were only shadows in motion. His thoughts were elsewhere. Back. In Paris, a young woman had disappeared. Not escaped, not run. Vanished. And now the man who had written her name in his book, whose letter had once made her expression change in the foyer of a boarding house, was dead. There was no scandal, no blood, only that vague sadness that always clung to the quiet ones, people who never made noise but whose lives ended with a small folding inwards. Maigret stayed a while longer, not because he expected answers, but because he wanted to feel the place. He always believed that places, like people, held residue. He wanted to understand what sort of man Laval had been, not by reports but by the air around his absence. When he returned to the station, the platform was quieter. He found a seat on the train and did not open a newspaper. He kept the address book in his pocket and watched the city recede once more behind glass. Evening would arrive by the time he reached Paris. Madame Maigret would be heating soup. He'd say little about the trip and she would not ask. He would sleep, perhaps, and dream of bridges and rain and the peculiar way some people leave nothing behind but questions. Tomorrow, he would go back to Rue des Écoles. He wasn't sure yet what he was looking for, but someone somewhere knew the shape of what had passed between Claire Delorge and Fernand Laval, even if they didn't know they knew it. It was still early when Maigret returned to the Rue des Écoles the next morning. A soft rain had started again, the kind that felt more like mist than drops, and the narrow street seemed suspended in a permanent hush. The bakery had just opened. The smell of rising dough drifted into the street, mingling with the odor of wet stone and last night's coal smoke. He paused at the corner, letting the setting settle around him before continuing. His presence in a place was never about arrival. It was about becoming part of it, not as a figure of authority, but as another detail in the background. Something absorbed rather than noticed. Inside the building he made no noise on the stairs. On the second floor he passed the open door of Madame Tessier's apartment. The old woman sat reading a paperback in large print, her feet wrapped in a plaid wool blanket. She glanced up but did not speak. Maigret climbed to the third floor. Claire Delorge's door remained shut, the spare key now hanging once more on the hook by Madame Tessier's window. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, hand on the worn banister, taking in the atmosphere of the hallway. Damp wallpaper, the faint hum of water pipes, the smell of someone's overcooked cabbage drifting from below. He turned back and knocked softly on the door opposite Claire's. After a few moments, it opened a crack. A woman in her 40s peeked out, eyes suspicious above her house dress. "Yes? I'm sorry to disturb you, Chief Inspector Maigret." Her eyes widened slightly, and she opened the door a little more. "I was wondering if you've seen Mademoiselle Delorge recently." She crossed her arms. "Not since 2 mornings ago. She left early. I thought she was going to work." "Do you know where she worked?" "I don't know. She never talked much, always polite, but distant. That kind of girl." Maigret nodded. "Did she receive visitors?" "Never that I saw. She kept to herself." "Did she ever seem afraid, nervous?" The woman hesitated. "No, not exactly. But there was something about her, like she was always watching something in her mind. I once said hello in the stairwell and she jumped as if I'd shouted." He thanked her, stepped back into the hall, and walked down to the first floor. Léonie Brot was not in sight, but her door stood open and he could smell coffee. He knocked lightly and she appeared, wiping her hands on a tea towel. "You're back," she said, not surprised. "I went to Lyon. I saw Laval's apartment." She nodded as if she had expected nothing else. "I think she loved him," she said softly. "Claire." "What makes you say that?" "The way she handled that letter. Not like it was news. Like it was something she hadn't dared hope would come." "Did she mention him to you?" "No, not by name, but she spoke once, very vaguely, about someone she had waited for. She said, 'He never promised me anything, but I kept waiting.' As if he had. I remember the phrase." Maigret sat down at her kitchen table. It was small, cluttered with knitting needles, biscuit tins, and a bowl of sugar cubes. Outside the small window, the rain traced fine silver lines on the glass. "She wrote to him," he said. "The concierge in Lyon saw the letters." Léonie nodded. "That sounds right. She had this way of folding her stationery, very precise. I saw her putting envelopes into the postbox in the hall some mornings. Do you know where she worked?" "She never said. But she dressed neatly every morning. Always a navy coat, a silk scarf, hair tied back. She had a kind of modest elegance. And when she returned at night, usually by 6, carried a book sometimes. Once or twice I smelled ink on her fingers, real ink, like from a fountain pen or maybe a press." Maigret filed the detail away. "And lately? Did anything change?" "She became thinner. You wouldn't notice unless you watched her often. Her face got sharper, her eyes more tired. I think the letters stopped, before that final one. She started walking in the evenings, long walks alone. Once she came back soaked from the rain, and I asked if she'd been caught in a storm. She just said, 'It doesn't matter.'" Maigret didn't respond. He lit his pipe slowly, the rhythm familiar and unhurried. "There's something I didn't tell you before," Léonie said after a pause. "The day she left and I found something in the rubbish bin in the hallway. It wasn't mine. It was torn into pieces, but I recognized the writing. Her hand." She went to a drawer and returned with a small envelope of browned paper. Inside were fragments of a letter, carefully gathered. Maigret spread them on the table. Some sentences were still visible. "If you think this is cowardice, then I cannot defend myself. I waited as long as I could. You were always the better part of me, even when you left." Maigret looked up. "Did you show this to anyone?" "No, I wasn't. Sure, I should have even kept it. But it felt wrong to throw it away. You were right to keep it." He smoked in silence for a few moments, then folded the pieces gently and placed them back into the envelope. There was no signature, no address, only grief, written and then discarded. At the prefecture later that afternoon, Maigret made quiet inquiries. He asked a clerk to search for any employment records under the name Claire Delorge. It took time, but eventually something turned up, a file card from a small legal publisher in the 6th arrondissement. She had worked there for 3 years. As a proofreader, quiet, reliable, no incidents. She had not reported for work in 2 days. The publisher had not yet noticed. Maigret went there in person. The office was on a side street off Boulevard Saint-Germain, above a shop that sold antique maps. Inside, the floorboards creaked, and the smell of dust mingled with cheap coffee. A man with narrow shoulders and a pipe too large for his face confirmed her employment. "Yes, Claire, always punctual. I know her grammar better than I do. A little melancholy, but never caused trouble." "Did she speak of personal matters?" "Never. But I sometimes saw her staring at the same page for minutes without turning it. She once came back from lunch with her eyes red. I didn't ask." "Was she close with anyone here?" "Not that I know of. She didn't join us for drinks. Ate lunch alone in the courtyard." Maigret stepped out into the corridor. He had learned nothing dramatic, but he didn't expect to. Each detail was a thread, and eventually they would pull together. Back on the street, he paused under an awning. The rain was steady now. He lit his pipe again and stood watching the passers-by, heads lowered, collars turned, footsteps splashing. Somewhere, he felt, Claire Delorge had not disappeared in the dramatic sense. She had simply slid out of view, like someone retreating behind a curtain of her own choosing. It wasn't guilt, he sensed. It was weariness. Tomorrow, he would speak to someone who had once known Fernand Laval. There had to be one, not to accuse, only to understand what had made them wait for each other so long, and what, in the end, had made them stop. It was early afternoon when Maigret returned to Rue des Écoles for the 3rd time in as many days. The rhythm of his visits was not based on procedure, but on atmosphere, a feeling that something here hadn't fully spoken yet. He often trusted such instincts more than evidence. A gesture out of place, a silence too complete, a locked door, too content in its stillness. He paused before entering the building, glancing up at the windows. Claire Delorge's curtains remained drawn. But now that he had seen the rooms she passed through daily, the desk where she corrected texts, the corner bakery, the foyer with its faint scent of varnish, he could better sense her presence, or rather the absence of it. Inside, the building was quiet, with only the sound of a wireless crackling faintly from someone's room on the 2nd floor. He knocked softly on Madame Tessier's door. She was seated near the window again, sipping her coffee, eyes narrowed as if reading between the lines of a thought. "She's not come back," she said, as though continuing a conversation they had never quite begun. "No," Maigret replied. "I didn't expect her to." He stood for a moment, hat in hand. Then, at her nod, he took the chair beside the radiator. The warmth seeped gently through his coat, and the ticking of the wall clock grew more noticeable. "I've been wondering," he said, "how many tenants you've seen come and go over the years." "Oh, dozens," she said with a slight shrug. "Some leave with noise, some with nothing but a broom-swept floor." "Did Claire seem like the type to leave quietly?" "She didn't seem like the type to leave at all. She struck me as someone who stayed, who waited." Maigret looked toward the window. In the courtyard, rain pooled between the tiles. A cat darted under a bench, its back hunched against the damp. "Did you ever hear her speak on the telephone?" "No. She didn't have one." "In the room. Went to the corner cafe sometimes. There's a payphone there. I may stop by." He stood, thanked her with a small smile, and left her to her coffee and her window. A short walk brought him to the cafe, a modest place with yellowing lace curtains and bentwood chairs. The air inside was thick with the smell of espresso and wet wool. A radio behind the counter played a sentimental tune from the previous decade. Maigret ordered a coffee and waited near the window. The payphone stood in the back, next to the toilets, a relic with a chipped coin tray and the receiver chained to the wall. The owner, a man in his 60s with an apron that had once been white, approached Maigret's table. "You're the inspector, aren't you? From the paper sometimes." Maigret nodded. "Looking for someone?" "Possibly. A young woman used to come here to use the phone. Dark hair, slim, quiet, always wore a navy coat." The man scratched his cheek. "Yes, I remember her. Never stayed long, always had change, spoke in a low voice but not secretive, more like she didn't want to disturb anyone." "Did she come recently?" "Last week, I think. Tuesday or Wednesday." Seemed tense, not like before. She stayed in the booth for a long time, 10 minutes, maybe more. "Did she speak in French?" "Mostly. Once or twice I thought I heard something in German." "Just a word or two, nothing clear." Maigret stirred his coffee. "Did she leave anything behind?" "No. Thank you." The man nodded and returned to his counter. Maigret sat for a while longer. He liked to sit in places people had inhabited. It allowed their presence to settle. He watched the cafe as Claire might have seen it, the same two old men playing dominoes, the young woman with a red scarf flipping through a magazine, the barkeeper polishing glasses as though the act were a private ritual. Nothing exceptional, but all part of the invisible map she must have followed daily. Later that afternoon, Maigret walked back to headquarters and requested files from Lyon's archives, old employment records, if any, for Fernand Laval. He didn't expect much. Laval had been a clerk in export, a man with no history on the surface. But sometimes the surface was deceptive. The file that arrived was thin, a few lines confirming employment at a firm that had since closed, no police record, a birth certificate from Toulouse. But there was one item that caught Maigret's eye. A line in the personal details, stating he had spent the winter of 1946 to 47 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Bavaria, registered as a French civilian attached to a reconstruction office. Garmisch, then Dow. Same name inscribed in Claire's book, in faded ink. Pour Claire en souvenir de Garmisch, 1946. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The post-war years had been full of such fragments. Men and women drifting across borders, letters delayed by months, lives interrupted not by choice, but by time. Maigret had seen dozens of stories like that, people clinging to a memory that had never been meant to last. He asked Janvier to look into post-war personnel registries, hoping to find if Claire had ever been in Germany, if perhaps they had known each other in those brief, uncertain years after the war. By dusk, it was raining again. Maigret left the office and returned to his apartment. Madame Maigret had made veal blanquette, the smell of which greeted him like an old friend. She didn't ask about the case. She never did unless he spoke first. He ate slowly, silently. Then he sat in his chair by the window, pipe in hand, watching the street below as lamps flickered into life and umbrellas blossomed like dark flowers along the pavement. "I don't know why she left," he murmured aloud. Madame Maigret, sitting nearby with her knitting, looked up. "Perhaps she was waiting for him to come back," she said. And when he didn't, she stopped waiting. He turned to her, surprised. She shrugged slightly. "It's just a feeling. Women know these things." He nodded, saying nothing more. But her words settled in him, like the final piece of a photograph slowly developing. The next morning he would go back to Rue des Écoles one last time. There was still something in that building, in that quiet room that hadn't finished speaking. The morning light was soft and grey, diffused through the low-hanging clouds that blanketed Paris in their pale hush. A thin fog clung to the banks of the Seine, as Maigret crossed the bridge near the Quai des Grands Augustins. His coat collar turned up, his hat pulled low. He walked without haste, but with direction, the kind of quiet resolve that came not from urgency but from certainty. The night had done its work. Madame Maigret's words had stayed with him, echoing not as a theory, but as something closer to understanding. He had long believed that cases at their core were not puzzles to be solved, but stories waiting to be heard in full. And the story of Claire Delorge was no longer just about a missing girl. It was about time, memory, and the long, silent erosion of waiting. At Rue des Écoles, the street was nearly empty. A boy in a cap delivered bread to the bakery, placing the warm loaves in a wire basket at the threshold. A woman with a shopping bag emerged from the épicerie, her steps unhurried. Maigret entered the building without ringing. On the third floor, the air felt stiller than before. He paused outside Claire's door. The curtain had shifted slightly, letting in a narrow blade of light. He stood for a moment, not knocking, just breathing in the space around him. Then he descended one floor and knocked gently on Léonie Brault's door. She opened it in her dressing gown, her hair wrapped in a towel. "Forgive the hour," he said. "I won't stay long." "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "The kettle's just boiled." He followed her in and took his usual seat by the small kitchen table. The smell of lavender hung faintly in the room, mixed with steam and the dry scent of old paper. She poured him tea without asking, then sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "You knew she was a translator, didn't you?" he asked. Léonie tilted her head slightly, uncertain. "She worked in publishing, yes, correcting things." "She translated from German. I saw a few books in her room. Old paperbacks, margins filled with annotations. And ink. You mentioned the ink on her fingers." Léonie nodded. "Yes, I noticed it. Always blue or violet, sometimes smudged under her nails. She learned German after the war, likely in Garmisch. That's where she met Laval." "You're sure?" "There was a note written in a book, and Laval's personnel file mentions Garmisch in 1946. Léonie sat back. "That would explain it. The waiting, the letters. They had something once, something unfinished, and it seems they tried to keep it alive through correspondence." Léonie looked down at her hands. "But people change. They do. Or sometimes they don't. And that's what breaks them." He drank from the chipped teacup, then set it down gently. "I believe he stopped writing to her some time ago. Or perhaps he wrote to say he wouldn't come back. The last letter, the one you saw, might have been an ending." She looked up sharply. "But if she loved him—" Maigret nodded slowly. "Then the ending wasn't hers. That's often the hardest kind." Silence settled again. Outside the window, a bird landed on the windowsill, then flew off without a sound. "I'd like to look at her room again," he said quietly. "I have the spare key." Together they climbed to the third floor. Léonie opened the door and handed him the key without a word, then stood just outside, as if unsure whether to intrude. The room was unchanged, but the light had shifted. A beam of pale sunshine filtered through the parted curtain, illuminating the edge of the bed and the corner of the writing desk. Dust floated gently in the air, undisturbed. Maigret moved slowly. He touched nothing at first, only looked. The wardrobe was still ajar, the empty space on the shoe rack still evident. He approached the desk and pulled out the chair. A stack of papers sat neatly beside the typewriter, draft translations, German into French, carefully typed, with margin notes in a precise, slightly slanted hand. But it was the letter beside them that caught his eye. Unfolded, unsent. It was written in French. The sentences were careful, formal, the tone not quite intimate, but heavy with restraint. It began without salutation. "I have decided not to go to Lyon. I understand that your silence means you have made your choice. I no longer wish to disturb your life. I release you, Fernand, from any obligation you may feel. But I will not pretend it costs me nothing. It ended without signature. Just a date. 3 days before Laval's death. Maigret read it twice, then replaced it where it had been. He opened the desk drawer. Inside was a small box of letters tied with twine. He did not untie them. He didn't need to. The room wasn't a crime scene, it was a monument to a life paused too long. He turned to leave, but his eyes caught on something else. A travel guide half tucked into the shelf. Lion, dog-eared, annotated, train routes underlined. She had planned to go. At some point she had prepared herself, but she hadn't gone. Not because she changed her mind, perhaps, but because someone else had decided for her. He stepped back out into the hall. Léonie looked at him with the quiet expression of someone who had waited without expecting answers. "Will you report her missing?" she asked. "No," he said. "She hasn't disappeared. She's simply gone." "You think she went to find him?" "I think she went to bury something." They walked together down the stairs in silence. At the door she stopped. "Will she come back?" Maigret looked toward the rain-washed street. A delivery cart clattered in the distance. Somewhere a piano played faintly through an open window. "If she does," he said, "it won't be for him. It'll be for herself." He tipped his hat and stepped out into the grey light, his steps slow but certain. He wasn't finished yet. There was still someone else to see. Someone who had once known both of them, or at least who had watched them without speaking. Every story has such a figure, and sometimes they know more than the ones in the center of the tale. It was the kind of morning that seemed to exist without beginning. The sky was an unbroken grey, and the light that fell over the Seine had no direction. Maigret walked along the left bank, not in search of anything in particular, but because walking often revealed more than asking. He passed the rows of bouquinistes, the weathered green bookstalls clinging to the stone parapet like barnacles on a hull, some already open, others still latched against the damp. He stopped before a stall that looked more lived in than the rest. The books were stacked unevenly, the postcards slightly curled at the edges, the newspapers yellowed. A man stood behind it, gloved hands wrapped around a thermos cup. His scarf tucked too tightly into his coat. Maigret had passed this man many times. He was part of the landscape of the quartier, not notable in any way except for his constancy. And now something in his memory aligned. One afternoon weeks ago, he had seen Claire Delorge here, pausing before this very stall, her gloved hand tracing the spine of a German paperback. "Cold morning," Maigret said. The man gave a short nod, eyeing Maigret with the wariness of someone who preferred silence to conversation. Maigret leaned slightly on the parapet. You might remember her, young woman, late 20s, dark hair worn tied back, always polite. She used to stop here. The man sipped his coffee, then set the cup down beside a box of foreign novels. "I remember," he said finally. "She came every Thursday morning between 9 and 10. Regular? Like clockwork. Picked through the German titles. Bought something now and then. Not expensive editions. Pocket books. Did she ever speak to you?" "Only once. Asked if I had a copy of Thomas Mann's Tonio Kröger in the Reclam edition. I didn't. She thanked me anyway." "Did she ever come with anyone?" "No, always alone. But someone watched her once, a man." Maigret said it more as a statement than a question. The man looked at him, not surprised. "You saw that too?" Maigret nodded slightly. "Thin fellow, maybe 40. Overcoat too long in the sleeves. He stood by the lamp-post and smoked, didn't approach her, but his eyes never left her hands." "That was Laval." The man rubbed his nose. "He came twice, then stopped. She still came, but after that she looked more, I don't know, hollow. Did she look for him? Not obviously, but she lingered longer, didn't browse the same way. Her fingers paused more often. Maigret looked down at the Seine. A barge passed slowly under the bridge, its motor sputtering faintly. The smell of wet stone and silt rose from the water. She was translating him, you know, Maigret said softly. The man raised an eyebrow. Not literally, but in a way. Laval. His silences, his choices. She was trying to turn him back into something she could understand. I suppose that's what books do, the man said after a pause. Let us finish what life cuts short. Maigret turned to leave, then stopped. Did she ever come? By after he died. The man thought for a moment. Once, last week. She didn't touch the books, just stood across the street for a long while, then walked away. Maigret nodded. Thank you. He walked slowly back along the quay, the sound of the river low and constant behind him. He had no dramatic proof, no resolution in the legal sense. But something was becoming clearer, not like a photograph developing, but like fog lifting, just enough to show the outlines of a figure already known. Later that afternoon, he returned to his office. Lucas brought in a folder with a few remaining inquiries, post-war civilian records, lists of temporary postings in Bavaria. There was no mention of Claire Delorge by name, but there was an entry for a Clara D., who had served as an interpreter with the French contingent in 1946. The address listed was a temporary billet, nothing more. Enough, though, to confirm what he already believed. They had met there, Claire and Fernand, in the fragile aftermath of the war. Two people adrift in a foreign place, speaking borrowed languages. Something had started between them, something unfinished. And then life, or indecision, had stretched the thread between them thinner and thinner, until it snapped with the silence of a final letter. He rose and went to the window. Rain had returned, tapping faintly against the glass. Paris below was unchanged, indifferent. People crossed streets without looking up. Trams passed with their low electric whine. He thought of Claire's room. The way it had remained untouched, as if she'd stepped out not to flee but to recover herself. He thought, too, of the note she'd written and never sent, the quiet dignity of its tone, and of Laval's own final note, folded beneath his shirt when he jumped. It was always going to be one of us. Maigret didn't believe either of them had meant to hurt the other. It was worse than that. They had simply been too late, in life, in courage, in hope. By early evening he was back at home. Madame Maigret was reading in her chair, her glasses perched low on her nose. "Still no word?" she asked. He shook his head and took his seat across from her. "She'll return," she said. Maigret didn't reply. "Not because anything's resolved," she added, "but because she's not the kind who disappears." And as he lit his pipe, letting the familiar tobacco smoke soften the room's silence, he realized she was probably right. Some disappearances are not vanishings. They are pauses, long, necessary pauses, after which a person either returns or becomes someone else entirely. And either way, the silence is its own kind of answer. The next morning arrived quietly, without any change in the grey weather that had blanketed Paris for nearly a week. A mist hung low over the city, softening the outlines of buildings and muffling the sounds of early traffic. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stood at his office, window pipe in hand, watching the reflection of riverlight flicker on the pane. There had been no new developments overnight, no reports, no sightings, nothing to suggest that Claire Delorge had returned or even left a more definite trace. And yet, Maigret did not feel stalled. It was as if everything that needed to be seen had already revealed itself, not in events but in gestures, habits, silences. He reviewed his notes again. Not that there were many. This had never become an official case. There were no fingerprints, no missing person form, no criminal complaint. Only a handful of names, 2 rooms, 1 envelope, and a kind of sadness that lingered in spaces where lives had failed to meet in time. By mid-morning, he felt a familiar restlessness, the kind that came not from uncertainty but from completion. He knew the shape of the story now, not all the details. Those would remain where they belonged, in memory, in feeling, but the truth of it had formed quietly, like frost along the edge of a window. Still, there was one more person he wanted to see. Not a witness, not a suspect, just someone whose voice had been present throughout, even when she had said very little. He walked again to Rue des Écoles, letting his steps fall into the same rhythm they had the last few days. The bakery was open. The scent of warm brioche reached him as he passed. A girl in a school uniform clutched a paper bag, biting into a croissant, her cheeks red from the cold. It was a weekday like any other. Inside the boarding house, the floor creaked under his shoes. He made no effort to be quiet. On the second floor, Madame Tessier's door was slightly ajar, the same radio playing softly in the background, something instrumental, slow and melancholy. She looked up as he stepped in. Her eyes, sharp and tired at once, studied him without question. "She's not back," she said. "I didn't think she would be." He sat down without invitation. She poured 2 cups of chicory coffee and handed him one. "I used to wonder what kind of girl she was," Madame Tessier said, not looking at him. "She reminded me of someone I once knew. A girl I shared a room with before the war. Same quiet, same way of folding things too neatly." Maigret didn't interrupt. "She never told me anything about her life, but I knew there was something behind it. Not a secret, not like people think, just unfinished business." "She wrote a letter she didn't send," Maigret said, "to Laval." Madame Tessier gave the smallest nod. "I suspected she would." She was in love, with a memory, not with him perhaps, but with who he once was to her. "And he?" the old woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted to close the door, quietly, but she wouldn't let it close all the way." She stirred her coffee once, twice. "Did you ever see them together?" "Only once," she said, "long ago. I think she didn't know I was watching. He came to the gate. She walked him back to the corner. They stood for a long time, not speaking. Then he tipped his hat and left. That was the last time." Maigret drank his coffee slowly. "She still wore the scarf he gave her. Did you notice?" "Every Thursday." There was no surprise between them, only recognition of something both had sensed without words, through routine, through shared space, through the way someone opens a window at the same time every day. Maigret stood and placed his empty cup on the saucer. "She'll return," Madame Tessier said after a pause. "Do you think so?" "She's not the vanishing kind." He smiled faintly. "That's what my wife said." He walked back into the hall but stopped before reaching the stairs. A voice echoed faintly from above. A female voice, low, muffled, but unmistakably real. He turned and climbed the stairs slowly, step by step. On the 3rd floor, Claire Delorge's door was slightly ajar. A suitcase stood by the wall. The curtains were now open. The pale light spilled across the floor. She was standing near the desk, her back to the door, folding a sweater. She didn't turn when he knocked gently on the frame. "I didn't expect you back so soon," he said. Her voice was calm. "I wasn't sure I'd return at all." "You don't have to explain." "I know." He stepped inside but remained near the door. "I went to Lyon," he said. "I thought you might." "I saw the letter and his note." She folded the sweater one last time and placed it in the drawer. Then she turned to him, her face composed but pale. It wasn't a story I wanted. Anyone to read, she said. It read itself. She gave a faint smile, not amused but resigned. I left because I needed to be somewhere without memories, but I came back because I suppose I needed my room to be mine again, not his shadow. Maigret nodded. It still is. There was nothing more to say, no questions to ask, no confessions to draw out. He stepped back into the hallway. Will they come looking for me? She asked quietly. No. No one has filed a report. You're not a missing person. She exhaled gently. Good. He looked at her one last time. Not as a detective, not even as a man trying to understand, but simply as someone bearing witness. If you ever feel like leaving again, he said, do it for yourself. Not because someone else has gone. She nodded, and the door closed softly behind him. Downstairs, Madame Tessier met his gaze through the open door. He didn't speak, just touched the brim of his hat and stepped out into the chill of late morning. On the street everything looked the same. Children laughed on their way to school. A lorry rumbled past. A man whistled as he swept his shop front. But something had shifted, not resolved, not repaired, just acknowledged, and sometimes that was enough. Maigret did not return to Rue des Écoles the following day, nor the day after that. There was no need. The rhythm of the story had completed its arc, and to return now would only be to prod at something that had already begun to heal in its own way. He knew when to stop listening, and he knew when silence meant acceptance, not absence. At the office, Lucas brought in a case file about a stolen delivery van near the Gare du Nord. Janvier reported a domestic dispute in Montmartre that had turned briefly violent but resolved itself before the officers arrived. The usual ebb and flow of the city's low hum, things that mattered and yet in a broader sense didn't. Maigret listened, made the necessary remarks, then returned to the window. The sky was clearing, the cloud cover breaking just enough to allow a single strip of sunlight to fall across the river. It struck the ripples like a blade, carving out a brightness that hadn't been seen all week. He watched it without moving, the pipe cold between his fingers. In the drawer beside him was a small folder he hadn't yet filed away. Inside were the minimal details: Claire Delorge's name, Laval's address, the notes he had jotted down in his thick round script. There was no need to send them anywhere. No superior was waiting for a report. But he kept them, not out of duty, but because stories like this never truly disappeared. They simply found a quieter place to live. On Thursday, he took his time leaving the office. He stopped for a sandwich at a café on Rue Saint-Honoré, then walked aimlessly at first, before finding his steps draw him, as if by habit, back toward the left bank. The booksellers were out again. The cold was still present, but the light had changed. People were lingering a bit longer at the stalls. Tourists with scarves, locals with their hands in their coat pockets. The river glinted with reluctant warmth. He passed the bookstall where Claire had once stood. The man was there again, adjusting a row of old detective novels with a gloved hand. He glanced up, recognized Maigret, and nodded. "Warmer today," he said. Maigret nodded in return. "You've had better customers?" "Not many, but one came by this morning. Bought a worn copy of Rilke, German edition. Asked if I remembered her." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "I said yes," the man added. She smiled, didn't say more. Maigret looked down at the place she would have stood. The spot was unremarkable, a stretch of stone parapet, a patch of worn sidewalk. But something hung in the air, barely perceptible, like the trace of perfume in an empty room. "Did she seem different?" he asked. The man considered it. "No, but she didn't seem the same either." Maigret smiled faintly. That sounds right. He left the key and took a turn down a narrow side street that led him toward the Luxembourg Gardens. The trees were bare now, their branches black against the late afternoon sky. A few scattered leaves still clung to the iron benches, and a gardener was sweeping the gravel paths with a kind of lazy devotion. He sat for a while, coat buttoned up, hat resting on his knee. He watched the people pass, students with books, an elderly couple arm in arm, a boy rolling a hoop past the fountain. No one noticed him. He preferred it that way. When he stood to leave, he walked not toward any destination, but in a direction that simply felt right. He ended up near Claire's building, though not at the door. Across the street, at the cafe, where she had once used the payphone, he entered and took a seat near the window. The same man was behind the counter, wiping glasses with a rag that had long given up its duty. He didn't recognize Maigret, or perhaps he did, and said nothing. Maigret ordered a coffee and sipped it slowly, watching the building across the road. The windows were mostly closed, curtains drawn against the faint light. But on the third floor, Claire's room, her window, was open. Only slightly. Just enough to suggest that someone had wanted fresh air, or light, or both. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet kind of peace, the kind that came from knowing something had found its place. He remembered what Madame Maigret had said. Not all returns are resolutions. Some are simply necessary. Claire had not run. She had needed distance, time, and when she returned, it was not to reclaim something, but to let go of it properly. Maigret rose, paid for his coffee, and stepped back into the street. A breeze moved through the trees above, scattering a few last leaves onto the sidewalk. Somewhere nearby a bell chimed the hour, soft and deliberate. He took a final look at the window, then turned away. There were other cases waiting. Other people to listen to. But this one, this quiet thread of a story, had closed in its own way, not with a conclusion, but with a gentle folding back into the everyday. And as he walked down the street, Maigret felt what he always hoped to feel when a case ended. Not justice, not closure, but something rarer. Understanding. 2 weeks passed. The mornings remained grey, though the bite of winter had lessened. The trees, still bare, stretched their dark limbs into a sky that refused to brighten. Paris drifted into late February like a ship with a slow keel, steady without fanfare. Maigret sat at his usual corner table at the Brasserie Dauphine, nursing his coffee long after it had cooled. The world beyond the window was in motion. Footsteps tapped past on wet pavements. A cyclist splashed through a puddle, and the daily chorus of car horns came and went like passing storms. He wasn't on a case, or rather he was between them. There had been an attempted burglary in the 15th, a petty embezzlement on the Rue Réaumur, a drunken scuffle outside a cinema that turned out to be a lover's quarrel. The usual. But something in him was still turned slightly inward, not by worry but by memory, the kind that lingers quietly, asking nothing, only waiting to be acknowledged now and again. It was almost noon when he took his coat from the back of the chair and stepped into the street. The rain had begun again, not heavy but persistent, tapping softly on his hat, misting the lapels of his coat. He walked without direction, only with a desire to feel the city around him. Near the Place Maubert, he stopped at a newspaper kiosk. It was one of those rounded metal booths, green with age, crammed with magazines and headlines that shouted without saying anything real. The vendor was a short man with a limp and a cheerful indifference. Maigret nodded, took a folded copy of Le Monde, and paid with exact change. Then, as he often did, he glanced at the smaller local paper, the one that listed funerals and death notices, tucked between the classifieds and weather forecast. It was a habit. One Madame Maigret never fully understood, though she had grown used to it. And there, halfway down the narrow column, was the name Laval Fernand. It was the final notice, the formal one, printed weeks after his death, just a few lines. No religious service, interred privately at Montparnasse, survived by no immediate family, mourned quietly. No mention of his profession, no photograph, just a name, a date, and the invisible weight of a life lived privately and ended even more so. Maigret folded the paper under his arm. He crossed the street and turned onto Rue de l'Abbé de l'Épée. The florist near the corner had a display of white lilies and yellow tulips under a striped awning, their petals glistening with rain. He paused almost without thinking, then continued on. By the time he reached Rue des Écoles, the rain had thickened slightly. The building looked the same. The windows, the facade, the narrow gate that still creaked when pushed. He did not go inside. There was no reason to. But across the street, beneath the awning of the same café where he had sat days earlier, he stopped. The café was half empty. A few regulars read their papers, and the owner wiped down the bar with his habitual gravity. Maigret ordered a coffee and sat by the window, his back to the door, his eyes on the opposite building. The third-floor window was open again just a little. A pale curtain fluttered slightly with the breeze. And then, not dramatically, not even fully, a figure moved past the window, a shadow barely perceptible, a woman. It might have been Claire, it might not. He did not need confirmation. He drank his coffee slowly, without looking again. Across the street, life was unfolding as before, but now the silence felt less like retreat and more like recovery. He thought of the early days of the case, if it could even be called a case, when a folded newspaper and a worried glance from a woman named Léonie Brault had brought him into this story. He remembered the hallway, the unopened letter, the words left half-written and torn into pieces, and he remembered Claire's voice, quiet but steady, saying, "I came back because I needed my room to be mine again." Outside, a boy ran past, with a bouquet of paper-wrapped flowers. A woman followed, laughing softly as she shielded her hair with her handbag. The world, Maigret thought, rarely paused for long. It moved forward whether or not you were ready. When he finished his coffee, he left a few coins on the table and stepped out into the light rain. The walk back to the Quai des Orfèvres was uneventful. The traffic flowed without incident. No one called his name, no urgent matters waited. In his office, he removed his coat, lit his pipe, and opened the newspaper again, this time not for the obituaries. Still, his eyes returned to that small square of print, Laval's name so simply placed, so quietly ended. He thought of Claire again, not with sadness, but with the faint, elusive feeling that sometimes came to him at the end of certain cases, not resolution, not triumph, but something more tender, as if a knot had loosened in someone's heart. That night, over dinner, Madame Maigret served leek soup and a roast chicken. She spoke of the grocer's new apprentice, who she claimed didn't know the difference between dill and parsley. Maigret listened, nodding, the events of the past week sliding into their place in his mind like books returned to the shelf. "You're quieter than usual," she said at one point. He shrugged. Was it a sad one? He considered that. "No, just quiet. Did you solve it?" "There wasn't really anything to solve." She smiled as if she understood. Later, as the city darkened and the wind picked up against the windows, Maigret sat in his chair with a book he never opened. He let the pipe burn out, let the silence fall. There would be more cases. There always were. But this one, the girl, the man, the letters, the long delay of words not said, would remain. Not for its drama, but for its truth. Some stories, he thought, are not told in courtrooms. They are told in glances, in windows half open, in footsteps returning up a familiar stairwell, and sometimes in a name read quietly in a column of print by a woman who still reads the obituaries. It was a Saturday morning when Léonie Brault appeared again at the Quai des Orfèvres, though Maigret didn't see her right away. She stood in the lobby, her coat buttoned up to the chin, gloved hands clutching her handbag with a quiet sense of purpose. She had not telephoned ahead. She had simply arrived, as people once did, trusting that presence spoke louder than requests. Janvier found her waiting near the tiled entrance, just beside the umbrella stand. "She's asking for you, Chief," Janvier said, a little puzzled. "The woman from Rue des Écoles." Maigret put out his pipe, stood, and went to her at once. "Madame Brault," he greeted her softly, not unkindly. "Would you like to come up?" She nodded. "If it's not too much trouble." He led her to the small meeting room adjacent to his office, away from the shuffle of clerks and the occasional banging of a door. She sat on the edge of the chair as before, her bag resting in her lap. She looked neither worried nor at ease, only deliberate. "I hope I'm not disturbing anything," she said. "Not at all. How can I help? It's nothing urgent, not a complaint. Nothing has happened, really." He waited. "I thought I should tell you something, just in case." Still he said nothing. "Claire came to see me." "When?" "Yesterday evening, around 6. She looked past him toward the window, though the curtains were drawn. She knocked on my door, politely like always. She wasn't trembling or in any kind of distress. In fact, she looked calm." Maigret watched her face carefully. "She said she wanted to return a book, one I had lent her months ago, a detective story, ironically. I had forgotten all about it. She handed it back and stood for a moment as if deciding whether to say more. And did she? Yes, but not directly. She spoke the way people do when they've rehearsed something in their head a dozen times and then say it differently. Anyway, Léonie opened her bag and removed a small envelope, not sealed, just folded neatly. She gave me this, said it wasn't addressed to anyone, and that I could read it, or not. Maigret took the envelope. He didn't open it right away. She said she was going away, not fleeing, not hiding, just elsewhere. She didn't say where, but she didn't seem afraid. Did she take anything? She had a small case and the same navy coat. That was all. Did you ask her if she planned to return? I didn't need to. Maigret nodded slowly, weighing the silence between them. Then he unfolded the letter. It was brief, not even a page, written in the same careful, even hand she had used in her translations. I no longer need to hold on to something that no longer holds me. There is peace in understanding, even when it comes late. Tell him I am well. Not happy, perhaps, but no longer waiting. There was no signature, no date, no indication of destination. Maigret refolded the paper and placed it gently on the desk. I wasn't sure what to do with it, Léonie said. I don't want to worry her, but I also didn't want to keep it for myself. You did the right thing. She reached for her gloves, then paused. I think she wanted someone to know, not everyone. Just someone. Maigret rose with her and walked her to the stairwell. Do you think she'll write again? She asked. He thought for a moment. Maybe, but even if she doesn't, you'll know she's all right. Léonie nodded. That's enough. She disappeared down the steps, her figure swallowed by the clatter and hush of the precinct. Back in his office, Maigret sat quietly for some time. He didn't reach for a file, or relight his pipe, or answer the ringing phone outside his door. He simply looked at the folded note on his desk and thought about the meaning of endings. So many cases in his life had concluded with confessions, arrests, convictions. But this one, if it could be called a case at all, had ended with something far less tangible and yet far more human, a release. Later that afternoon he left the office and walked without purpose, letting the rhythm of the city guide his steps. He found himself once more along the Quai Voltaire, near the same bookstalls where paperbacks with worn covers still sat in the wind, waiting for hands to lift them. The man at the stall gave a nod. "She was here," he said before Maigret could ask. "Yesterday morning. Bought 2 books, one in German." "Did she say anything?" "No, but she smiled. First time I saw her do that." Maigret nodded. "Thank you." He wandered a little further. The cafes had begun to fill, the clinking of cutlery and soft chatter drifting out to the street. Couples held hands under umbrellas. A priest hurried past with his collar turned up. The world was busy being the world. At the corner, he paused before a kiosk and bought the day's paper. He didn't check the obituaries this time. That evening, he returned home to find Madame Maigret in the kitchen, rolling out dough for a tart. "You're early," she remarked without turning. "I suppose I am." She set the rolling pin aside and turned to him. "Did she come back?" "No, but she said goodbye." Madame Maigret smiled softly. "That's rare." He hung. His coat sat at the table and poured himself a glass of wine. She was never really missing, he said, just waiting for permission to stop. And now? She gave it to herself. They ate simply that night. The tart was warm, and filled with apple slices and a hint of cinnamon. Afterward, Maigret sat by the radio while the news droned faintly in the background, a voice more rhythmic than informative. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds had thinned, revealing patches of blue between the rooftops. From the window, he watched the wet street reflect the lights of passing cars and imagined Claire somewhere far enough to be free, close enough to be remembered. He didn't need to know more. Some truths do not require proof. They only need to be felt, like the certainty that a letter was written and then left behind, not to ask for rescue, but to confirm release. And perhaps in a quiet boarding house on Rue des Écoles, a room was still warmed by the sun through its now unshuttered window, no longer waiting, simply being. It was early March when Maigret found himself once again crossing the Pont Neuf, the wind sharp but not unfriendly, cutting through the last layers of winter. The thaw had begun, not all at once but in small ways. A trickle in the gutters, birds returning to the trees, the scent of something green barely surfacing beneath the stone and iron of the city. He wasn't thinking of Claire Delorge that morning, or rather, he wasn't thinking about her in the way one thinks of a case. There was no more investigation, no more questions. Only the lingering presence of someone whose story had folded itself into the edges of his days. A presence like old music, no longer heard, but still remembered in the silence between sounds. The Quai des Orfèvres was quiet. He arrived just before 8, hung his coat by the radiator and opened the window a few inches to let in the damp morning air. The city was stirring beneath him. A fruit cart rumbled over the cobbles. Somewhere a woman laughed. Somewhere else someone was shouting to be heard. He poured himself a coffee from the metal pot that had gone bitter from overuse and sat at his desk, lighting his first pipe of the day. Across from him, a stack of reports waited, each with a clipped note on the front. Arson in the 14th, a counterfeit ring in Belleville, a sailor found dead near the Gare de Lyon. Life went on. But before he reached for them, his hand drifted, instead to the thin envelope that still sat in his drawer. Claire's final note, folded, not sealed. He had read it 3 times, then let it be. And yet today he unfolded it again, not to scrutinize but to remember. I no longer need to hold on to something that no longer holds me. It was rare, Maigret thought, to find such clarity in the people he encountered. Most clung, stumbled, tried to rewrite endings as beginnings. Claire had let the thread fall where it would. By 10, the usual rhythm had resumed. Lucas came in with an update on a pickpocketing incident in the 2nd arrondissement. Janvier reported that the driver of the stolen van had been found, still, drunk, asleep in the vehicle, parked neatly behind the theatre on Rue Blanche. Routine. Later that day, a small note arrived from the prefecture, nothing official. Just an inter-office envelope, creased at the corners, addressed in fine cursive. Inside was a single page, the obituary column from a small-town weekly paper near Grenoble. Maigret read it slowly. In loving memory of Claire Delorge, 1923-1957, quietly passed. A private farewell was held at dawn, no flowers by request. Those who knew her are asked to remember her as she lived, with quiet resolve. There was no mention of survivors, no city of birth, no cause of death, only a brief closing line. She once translated sorrow with great elegance. He held the page a moment longer than necessary. Then he folded it, placed it with her letter, and closed the drawer. There would be no follow-up, no confirmation, no inquiry into the circumstances. It might have been illness. It might have been something else. It did not matter. What mattered was that she had written, had returned, had made peace in her own way. And now, even in passing, she had left only what she wished to leave. That evening, Maigret walked home. Through the Latin Quarter, the smell of bread warm in the air and the Seine moving quietly beneath the lamps. The cafes were beginning to fill. In one window he saw a couple laughing over shared wine. In another, a man hunched over a chessboard, deep in thought. When he reached his building, Madame Maigret was at the window, waving gently before disappearing into the kitchen. He climbed the stairs slowly, the ache in his knees familiar but manageable. He hung his coat, poured a glass of wine, and joined her at the table. "Did you eat?" she asked. "Not yet." "I made stew, with the marrow bones the way you like." He smiled and thanked her. The radio was on, a soft chanson from decades past. As they ate, he told her a little about the pickpocket, about the drunk in the delivery van, about Lucas's poor attempt at handwriting a report. But not about Claire. That chapter, he felt, had already turned. After dinner, he sat by the fire, with a book. It remained unread on his lap. His pipe was unlit, his gaze on the hearth, where the flames had long since died out. He thought of Léonie Brault, who had noticed the smallest changes, a mist curtain being drawn, a folded letter, in a hallway bin. She had done more for Claire than most detectives ever could. He thought of Laval, who had been unable to say what he needed to say until the very end, and perhaps even then, not clearly. And he thought of Claire, not as the girl who disappeared, or the woman who returned, but simply as someone who lived too long in the space between waiting and leaving. Outside the night deepened. The city glowed with its usual rhythm, the hum of tires on wet streets, the faint clang of dishes from nearby kitchens, the distant bell of a tram crossing the bridge. Before bed, he looked once more at the folder, in his drawer. Then he opened it, removed the 2 pieces of paper and burned them in the small fireplace, feeding them in one at a time. No need to keep the echo of something already finished. He stood by the window afterward, watching the rain, bead gently against the glass. Some names, he thought, do not appear in great histories. They are not tied to scandal, nor whispered in courtrooms. They are not remembered for what they changed, but for the quiet way they survived, and finally let go. Claire Delorge would not be discussed among the ranks. Her name would not pass between officers in the corridors of the precinct, but in Maigret's mind she would remain, a figure walking quietly into the morning fog, coat closed against the wind, no longer expecting anything from the world but the freedom to walk forward, and that perhaps was the truest resolution he had ever known.